In the year 1999, I was living in London, England, and I was at Safeway, the grocery store, lined up at the aisle checkout, and there was a elderly British gentleman in front of me with his groceries. And he came up to the fellow at the checkout, who was a appeared to be a South Asian Indian immigrant with a strong accent. And that fellow beeped the gentleman's groceries, and then he told him the cost was like 34.95 or whatever. And then the British elderly gentleman responded to the fellow at the checkout, the immigrant, by saying, "What's that? Can't understand a word you're saying, son. Learn to speak the Queen's English." And I was taken aback. Sadly, I didn't say anything at the time, but I was taken aback by what, in retrospect, I would call an example of targeted ethnic accent bullying, which can be very significant and impactful and have enormous adverse impacts on individuals and on immigrant communities. And I saw an example of that just in the last 2 days with Donald Trump talking to an Indian journalist in a press conference. I want to play that clip and then debrief it a little bit.
President, people in India will naturally welcome your decision to extradite Tahabur Rana to India back home. In that context, I'd like to ask you a question about, in last few years, we have seen several groups in the US raising anti-India voice, calling about separation, terrorism activities in India. Do you think that should continue here in the US as well?
You can go louder.
Mr. President, people in India would be welcoming your decision to extradite Tahabur Rana to.
I can't understand a word he's saying. It's not it's the accent.
Okay, note a few things. First of all, that Donald Trump allows him to talk for a fair length of time, 20 plus seconds, sharing his question. And then in a very sort of laconic way, a lackadaisical way, Trump just says, talk, speak louder. When in retrospect, it will be clear that the volume of this gentleman's speech was never an issue. It wasn't how loud he was speaking that was the problem of Trump's alleged lack of comprehension. So by telling him to speak louder, what he's functionally doing is spreading out or drawing out the process of the failure of communication, which will merely highlight the impact of humiliation directed upon this journalist. So the journalist then begins to speak again and restate his question. And notably, Trump then interrupts him, cuts him off mid sentence, and says, I can't understand a word he's saying. Now, a couple things to note there. First thing is it's clearly hyperbolic unless Trump is either deaf or has some cognitive issue. Because when I listen to him as a North American English speaker, I can readily pick up perhaps 90% of what he's saying, maybe more. There's some things I probably lack in terms of comprehension because I don't know the context that he's responding to in terms of the protests in America with regard to India. But I get most of what he's saying. When Trump says, I can't understand a word, a single word he's saying, it's clearly hyperbolic. It's exaggeration for effect to underscore the inability that this man allegedly has to communicate. And then he says it's the accent. So that's the issue, not the volume of speech, the accent, the issue that the man allegedly cannot articulate himself in a way that is even minimally comprehensible by a North American English speaker. Again, clearly false, but that's the message that is communicated. And what's really notable here is he also doesn't talk to the journalist. He doesn't say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you restate it? He says, I can't understand what he's saying. By not responding to the journalist, Trump implies the journalist himself would have a lack of comprehension if Trump spoke back to him about his lack of comprehension, which suggests that the journalist has even worse English skills than he would otherwise have because he allegedly wouldn't be able to understand Trump's concern, and so Trump has to relay it to a third party. All of this is a way of highlighting humiliation and shame at that journalist targeted to his accent. And because the accent itself is a tied with an ethnic identity specifically, it's an Indian accent. It's not just like a geographically regional accent that many people hold, but one that is tied with the Indian ethnicity. It becomes a type of bullying by way of targeting the accent. And so we would call it ethnic accent bullying. Uh, and one of the big concerns about this is this time and again, what Trump does is he normalizes xenophobic, ethnic, sort of discriminatory and racist language and thought patterns. Think, for example, back to COVID when he talked repeatedly about the Kung flu virus. That's one way of how he would speak in a very racist way that targeted visible minorities. Here, he targets visible minorities in terms of Indians. And so, because he is the commander in chief, the president of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, he can now normalize those same kind of attitudes in the general population. So, the next time a person, a MAGA supporter, for example, is angry at a telemarketer because they have trouble understanding aspects of their accent or they just don't like what they're saying on the phone, what they can say to them is, I can understand a word you're saying. Doesn't anybody there speak English? Which would clearly be discriminatory, racist, ethnic accent bullying, but that which had already been normalized by the conduct of the President of the United States in a press conference. The great irony here is that most of these people who are bilingual or they may be polyglots speaking multiple languages, they're shamed and humiliated by people who, in all likelihood, are monolingual, only speak one language, but nonetheless have the temerity, have the audacity to attempt to humiliate immigrants who speak multiple languages simply because they ostensibly cannot understand their accent, and then to imply somehow that that immigrant is intellectually inferior in virtue of their alleged inability to be understood by the monolingual American. The whole thing is so offensive, and all of that flows out of and is tied to this exchange with this journalist in a press conference. So tell you this, in the times that we live, this is just one tiny blip on the news feed of the way that Donald Trump conducts himself. But I thought nonetheless, because this is a passion of mine, I've been involved with immigrant communities in various respects since the early 1990s when I worked with international student ministries in university. So I see how these racist, xenophobic bullying attitudes and microaggressions can really target, harm, and otherize immigrant and visible communities. And I wanted to highlight that in a video here and how tragic it is that all of that is coming from a president of the United States.